This is part 2 of the Iron Islands. In part 1, I talked about the makeup of the Iron Islands, gave a general overview, and talked about how they were first settled. In part 2, let's talk about life on the Iron Islands and their reaving culture that resulted from it. So life is hard on the cold, wet, windswept islands with barely fertile rocks and thin soil, few trees, few safe harbors, and stormy seas around the islands that wreak havoc. The soil of the Iron Islands is so thin and stony that it is suitable for the grazing of goats, but not really for the growing of crops. Any crops their land does manage to grow are taken care of mostly without the use of animals that might make their job easier, such as oxen or horses. This obviously could create a huge problem for feeding their people, so to avoid famine, the Ironborn rely on fisherfolk to supply the islands with food. It is their catch that feeds the Ironborn and keeps them from starving during the winter. The fisherfolk reap the bounty of their waters filled with great schools of black cod, monkfish, skate, icefish, sardines, and mackerel. Along the shores of the islands are crabs and lobsters, and west of Great Wick are whales, swordfish, and seals. Because this role is so important to the islands and their way of life, 7 of every 10 families on the islands are fishermen, and despite how poor the family may be, on their ships, they are their own master. And this belief is held by almost all Ironborn. Archmaester Hake wrote, "The man who owns a boat need never be a thrall, for every captain is a king upon the deck of his own ship." However, despite the fisherfolk keeping the Iron Men alive, they don't hold the highest honor in their culture, their Reavers do. Or, as the men of the Westerlands and Riverlands called them, wolves of the sea. A large part of Ironborn culture surrounds reaving and paying the iron price, though more so before Aegon's conquest, as when he took over the 7 kingdoms, he forbade reaving. Still, singers, smallfolk, and priests of the islands praise Reavers and their deeds. Dagon Drum, the necromancer, Hrothgar of Pike and his kraken-summoning horn, Droll the Whale, and Torgon the Terrible are a few of their legendary figures. However, Balon Blackskin is the most infamous, who was said to fight with an axe in his left hand and a hammer in his right. No weapons made by man could hurt him. Axes shattered on his skin, and swords made no mark on him. Though, due to literacy being rare on the islands, as that skill is mocked for being for weaklings or sorcerers, much of the Iron Men's history actually comes from the people they plundered and terrorized, written in the Old Tongue and the runes of the First Men. So who knows if these people ever existed, as is the case with most legends. It is believed that their reaving culture began by the lack of wood on their islands. Long ago, in the dawn of days, there were thick forests on Harlaw, Orkmont, and Great Wick, but soon they disappeared as more and more ships were built. They were then left with no other choice than to turn to the forests of the mainland of Westeros, which also had other resources ripe for the taking. But there's a few other reasons as well that they may have started reaving. The islands themselves have few precious resources, besides iron, lead, and tin, making raiding the mainlands more enticing. And the resources that they did have on their islands required dangerous labor that the Ironborn felt weren't for them. So with this desire for more wood, precious metals, and indentured servants to work their mines, the Ironborn took to raiding the mainland early in their history, which I'll go more into their reaving history in a future video, as they did have periods where this practice came to a halt. But at the height of their reaving times, the Ironborn were truly terrifying. They would appear out of the morning mist, crossing the sea in their swift longships, and raid, rob, and rape peaceful villages and towns up and down the shores of the Sunset Sea. They never went too far from the sea, their religion keeping them close to water, but typically raided and terrorized from Bear Island and the frozen shore down to the Arbor. The mainlanders' ships easily fell to the Ironborn ships, and on shore, mighty kings and famous warriors fell before the Reavers in such numbers that they claimed the Ironborn were demons risen from some watery hell, protected by fell sorceries and possessed of foul black weapons that drank the very souls of those they slew. After they were done reaving, they would disappear back out to sea before the sun hit the highest point with ships full of plunder, women, and children. As little was taken in trade, they mostly bought things in blood at the point of a sword or an edge of an axe. The things they acquired through these raids was said to have been claimed by having paid the iron price. Though, as I will go over in a future video, due to Aegon the Conqueror attempting to curb their raiding and forbidding them from attacking the mainland, this is considered the old way, and not as prominent, even if many Ironborn wish for the old ways to return, a wish that may have been recently answered in the books. Those that didn't reave are said to have paid the gold price to acquire the plunder brought home. And, of course, the farmers they stole from often starved while the Ironborn feasted. As this raiding culture continued, the Greyjoys eventually boasted, "We do not sow," and styled themselves the Lord's Reaper of Pike. And that leads us to the last topic of part 2, and something that was very important to their culture: thralls or indentured servants. The captives the Ironborn brought back were forced to serve their captors as thralls. And thralls were different than slaves in that they retained certain rights. A thrall belonged to his captor and owed him service and obedience, but he was still a man and not property. Thralls could not be sold or bought, they could marry or own property, and their children were born free, as any baby born on the islands is considered Ironborn. These children could not be taken until the age of 7, when they typically joined a ship's crew or began an apprenticeship. As reaving and fishing were the only worthy occupations of true Ironborn, the captured men that weren't ransomed back with gold were mostly forced to farm or mine. Farming was preferable, as many of the thralls that worked the fields could marry and have children. The thralls forced to work the mines weren't so lucky. Their masters were cruel, as they toiled in the dark, dangerous pits beneath the hills, and their lives were often short. Thralls that could write, read, and count became tutors, scribes, and stewards. Other thralls became carpenters, stonemasons, or took up other craft trades. Despite men being their workhorses, it was the young women that were most prized. Older women were used as cooks, seamstresses, weavers, midwives, and such, but the fair maidens and girls near their flowering were taken on every raid. While most of these girls would spend their days as whores, serving girls, household drudges, or wives to other thralls, the most beautiful and strongest would be kept as salt wives. These women were not whores, bed slaves, or concubines, but actual wives with wedding ceremonies typically performed by priests of the drowned god. Interestingly, men of the Iron Islands could have as many salt wives as they could afford, and they were almost always the women and girls captured during raids. The more salt wives spoke to the man's wealth, power, manliness, and sex drive. However, only one rock wife, a freeborn woman of the Iron Islands, is allowed. She and her children will always come before all others, and her place is by her husband's side in board and bed. But again, with Aegon the Conqueror, who was seen as a bit of a wet blanket by the Ironborn, when he conquered the Seven Kingdoms and eventually the Ironborn, he made stealing women a crime and forbade reaving on the mainland, putting salt marriages mostly on the decline. In part 3, I want to start talking about the history of the Ironborn, starting with the Age of Heroes and continuing on to their first rock and salt kings. I'm also working on a video solely on the Drowned God because I love their religion. Please give this video a thumbs up and come back every Sunday for my audio-only Game of Thrones videos, Wednesday for my wildcard Game of Thrones videos, and besides that, there's Star Wars comics and anything sci-fi, fantasy, or horror related.